Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the United Nations Association of the USA, commonly called UNA-USA? What has UNA-USA done over the past 70-some years, or even longer than that, to help Americans better understand international issues and the United Nations? My guest today is going to bring us up to date on this very interesting organization. My guest today is Jim Wurst. Mr. Jim Wurst is a journalist specializing in international affairs. He is the author of the UN Association USA, A Little-Known History of Advocacy and Action. Jim Wurst, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you.
I appreciate you being with me. I've mentioned your book in the opening, and it's really a very fascinating book, which we will get into in just a moment. The UN Association USA, A Little-Known History of Advocacy and Action.
Right.
Why did you decide you wanted to write a book about UNA-USA, and what is UNA-USA?
It was a collective project. It wasn't my idea alone. There were several other people, including the last president of UNA-USA before it merged with the UN Foundation, Ed Elmendorf, conceived of the idea, and he drew together a team, and I was the lead author on the book. What is UNA-USA? Every member state of the UN can have a United Nations Association. So you have a UNA Canada, UNA Singapore, UNA China, etc. So the UNA USA obviously is one of the oldest and largest organizations that works to promote the United Nations and the ideals and projects of the United Nations. And of course in the United States, it has the extra layer being the host country and being the largest almost everything in the room. So,
It's one of the largest nonpartisan foreign policy associations in the United States, 501c3 organization. It has right now, I think, roughly about 22,000 members and 150 chapters around the United States. And full disclosure, I've got to admit, I know I've been involved in UNA-USA for a lot of years. In fact, I was chair of the UNA-USA national group that headed up the field operation several years ago, a couple of decades ago now. But it's a very interesting organization, and it does an immense amount of work by volunteers. All the folks are volunteers. There are some paid staff, but they're volunteers to help Americans better understand the United Nations. What role did UNA-USA play either prior to June 26, 1945 in San Francisco in launching the UN, or even prior to or during that time?
it actually began as the League of Nations Association, which is what it sounds like, that it began after the League of Nations to promote U.S. entry, ratification of the Covenant of the League of Nations, and we all know that didn't work. But they continued working to promote internationalism, and also the League of Nations had specialized agencies like the International Labor Organization. So the UN was the League of Nations Association continued to promote engagement, and then once you got closer to World War II, then they started reaching out first as an internationalist organization that we should be supporting the Allies. They were very early understanding that Nazism was just not some this year's political philosophy, and so they were very much in favor and advocating for the U.S. engagement, if not actually fighting, but at least aiding the Allies, aiding Britain in particular. And then, of course, after Pearl Harbor, that was no longer a debate, and then they shifted to the creation of an international organization that would replace the League of Nations, and when the war ended, because their main point was, and shared by the U.S. government, even though the U.S. government wasn't on record saying this, is that they had to establish the organization before the war ended. If they waited until after the war ended, the energy would dissipate, infighting would take place, and it would never happen. And they were right. They had to do it before the war ended.
The timing was perfect. It was absolutely perfect, right on the money.
They were right. They learned lessons from the League of Nations, and they had a lot of foresight. They had a lot of energy, and they had the organization had a lot of allies in government, both executive and in Congress. So yeah, it worked well.
I mentioned earlier about the lead up to the signing of the charter in San Francisco in June 26, 1945, but as I recall reading about that particular event, there were a lot of groups, very prominent groups, such as Rotary International, Lions International, that were very involved in San Francisco helping to launch the United Nations. Did UNA USA play a major role as far as being involved in helping to write the charter or in some other capacity in helping to move that process along?
Again, it was the League of Nations Association at the time.
Right.
They were the same people.
I can't learn that.
I know. It was the League of Nations
Sorry.
Association until around 44, 45. Then it became the American Association for the United Nations, and it wasn't until 1964 that they became UNA USA. So it's not to confuse everybody with acronyms, we'll just say UNA.
That's good.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
The UNA was one of the consulting organizations that was at San Francisco. This was an innovation. It was what we now would consider consulting NGOs. You know, at the UN, you have NGOs that specialize in certain fields, and that they're involved in if not involved in negotiations, at least involved in debates. So in San Francisco, the U.S. had a core group, I think, of about 32 organizations, including UNA, Rotary, Lions, NAACP, a number of trade unions, religious-based groups, Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish, and trade organizations, not necessarily the trade unions, but what we call now Chamber of Commerce, wheat growers associations, steel makers, this sort of thing. So they were all involved. Oh, and of course, the number of women's groups. I can't remember exactly, because the ones that we know of now didn't exist then, so I don't remember. But there's like women's leagues of various sorts, League of Women Voters, and some others. So they were involved, and they were doing what NGOs now do, promoting as broad a mandate for the new organization, what became the United Nations. And their goal was that once the charter was approved, they'd, again, learning lessons from the League of Nations, start building grassroots and political support for the charter to get it ratified.
And of course, that was really a very, I think, euphoric time, especially after the horrific devastation of World War II, 60 million people being killed, Europe laying in ruins, parts of Asia had been destroyed. And here they were bringing online an organization that hopefully was going to bring the countries of the world together under one roof to resolve, hopefully, again, their problems peacefully. And so there were so many groups, literally hundreds, that were involved in writing articles about it, promoting them in their magazines or trade magazines and that type of thing. Who were some of the early leaders, some of the most famous leaders, as far as helping to launch the what eventually became the United Nations Association of the USA?
Okay, one thing I should point out that everything I'm saying is about United States groups.
Exactly right.
So there were, this was not a U.S., it was, the charter was largely a U.S. initiative, but, there were more than Americans, NGOs or civil society organizations at San Francisco, but the book is about the United States. The key people, there were two outside of government. One was Clark Eichelberger. I'll plug the book again. If you hold it up, you'll see that the gentleman with Eleanor Roosevelt is Clark Eichelberger, a Chicago native who fought in World War I. And served in World War I. He was actually a quartermaster, and he was part of the League of Nations Association for almost his entire existence, and really promoted the American internationalism, and then the international organization, and then the United Nations, and then after there was the United Nations, to make it as much a part of U.S. foreign policy as possible. In other words, it was his lifelong mission was the United Nations. The other key person from outside of government was James T. Shotwell, who was an amazing intellect. He wrote the charter for the International Labor Organization. He helped write the UN Charter. He was president of the Carnegie Corporation. It just has an amazing record of involvement in helping shape the interwar years. Thinking on international affairs. So these are the two guys, and I kept saying outside of government. Inside of government, you start with Franklin Roosevelt and you work your way down. There were a lot of people very much involved in the State Department, in the White House, who were favorably disposed to an international organization. Some were true believers, but it was Eichelberger and FDR. They had a personal relationship. It's very strange. You read Eichelberger's memoirs, and he talks about the number of times he met FDR while he was president, but he never explained how he met FDR. But he did. He had several meetings with him, and there was this convergence of interest. They had the same goal in mind, but FDR couldn't go too far ahead of public opinion or of Congress. So Eichelberger was very happy to be the front man, and he promoted these policy ideas. And if they took off, then FDR adopted them. If they didn't, then they fell by the wayside.
Mm-hmm. And of course, remember, Eleanor Roosevelt was very critical. She was very involved in helping to develop the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, played a pivotal role in that. President Truman was involved. You mentioned a minute ago, too, about how UNA-USA, United Nations Association of the USA, is one, and it's one of basically 100 UNAs around the world, and it's also part of a larger organization called WFUNA, the World Federation of the United Nations Associations. And our viewers, with all these acronyms we're throwing around today, people are saying, what is WFUNA, what is UNA?
Yeah, that's why I'm trying to avoid that, but
they
you
can
can't.
go, no, I'm doing it, not you, but they can go to wfuna.org and tap into that organization. You can go to unausa.org and find out a lot more about the United Nations Association of the USA. Now, one of the basic plans by FDR in trying to launch the United Nations was to set up the Security Council, the 5 permanent members who were supposed to help keep peace and security around the world. Before the ink dried on the charter, pretty much they were starting the Cold War, and it didn't quite work like that. What has UNA-USA, we'll just focus on the U.S. for the moment, done to, or what did it do to try to help overcome some of those Cold War inhibitions, to try to promote better communication, shall we say, amongst the key players, especially the United States and the Soviet Union?
The two guiding principles of the UNA were the strongest United Nations possible and U.S. support for the United Nations. They wanted the United Nations to be the key, the key point, the key touchstone of U.S. foreign policy. So they were not, obviously, they were not happy with the paralysis that came into place. But in terms of the overall, I mean, the Security Council was one element, but of course there were other things, as you pointed out, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which at that point did not involve Eleanor Roosevelt, because when she was First Lady, she wasn't involved in this. It was after in the Truman presidency that she became a delegate to the United Nations. So it was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was relief agencies, everything we know now, UNICEF, World Health Organization, International Labor Organization. So it was the entire package. Decolonization was a huge issue for UNA. So there was always a paralysis, and one of the ways they would counter that is that they were always in favor of a very strong Secretary General, and they were always, if it came down to gray area that wasn't in the charter, if it was something, well, should the Secretary General do this? Their answer was yes. Because the Secretary General was, in theory, the best counterweight to a stalled Security Council.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would encourage our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com and review some of our previous shows. Also, if you have an interest in these international topics and would like to share this information with other people in your community or wherever it might be, or if you're involved with a public broadcasting system or a community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution, or you just have a website, please go to our website at globalconnectionstelevision.com and download any shows and feel free to put them on the air. Again, Global Connections TV is provided at no cost, free of charge, as an international public service. Today we're talking with Mr. Jim Wurst, and Jim Wurst is the author of a very interesting book that he recently wrote. It's on the United Nations Association of the USA, and we're talking about the role of UNA-USA in helping to inform Americans about international issues and the United Nations. Jim, we were talking about we could get into a myriad of activities,
yes,
right? And you mentioned what was in the charter and what wasn't in the charter. One thing that really is prominent today that wasn't in the charter was peacekeeping. There have been, I think, over 70 missions over the past several years or more, probably of peacekeepers. And today there are 16 missions operating with over 120,000 troops in some very dangerous areas of the world. You have covered peacekeeping in, I think, Namibia, Mozambique, different places like that. How do you perceive peacekeeping and the importance of peacekeeping and how it has evolved over the years?
At the beginning, I should say, it's not in the charter. So they began with mostly in the Middle East, in what's now Israel, in the Sinai, Lebanon. So these were basically monitoring ceasefire lines. And then, of course, it evolved into something much more assertive. Congo in the 1960s was that peacekeepers were inserted into a shooting war. Putting aside Korea, which was, a quote-unquote police action, that was not a peacekeeping mission, which was something that the UNA was supportive of. But then when you get into what we think of now as in terms of peacekeeping, so it was always a question, as it evolves and becomes more assertive, UNA, starting I would say in the late 60s, early 70s, began a very long and distinguished series of policy. Let's just call them policy papers. The programs had different names over the years. But here what they were doing was they had shifted from simply supporting the United Nations to trying to frame foreign policy in the UN context, and to have the U.S. engage with the UN in all international matters. So they had a number of policy papers on peacekeeping, on Soviet-U.S. relations, on nuclear disarmament, on the environment, on workers' rights, the whole range. And so as I said, peacekeeping was part of that to ensure that peace, not to get too much into the jargon, peacekeeping and peace building were done effectively with the proper resources and the proper mandate. We could talk 2 hours on that, but I think that kind of gives a sense of where it was that UNA was with the UN throughout the various stages in development of peacekeeping to make it as effective as possible within the charter.
Also, in an effort to promote better communication, better understanding of the issues from all sides, there were various studies projects you alluded to earlier, I believe, supported by UNA, USA, focusing on China, the United States, Russia. How did those operate, and why were they important?
This started off as they call it parallel studies. There's a phrase in diplomacy called two-track diplomacy, or track two diplomacy, where individuals from different countries, from two countries, would be talking to each other about their countries, but they are not officials. So in this case, in the first case, it was the United States and the Soviet Union. So it was the UNA USA and the UNA USSR talking and meeting and discussing issues of common interest. The United Nations, peacekeeping, nuclear disarmament, China. Remember, at this point, China was very isolationist. So so of course, they were unofficial, but they could, when they went back, they could and would report back to the governments. So this is a way of governments talking to each other without talking to each other, and giving them deniability if something didn't go right or go to their liking. So this started in the mid-70s. The woman most responsible for that is named Toby Gaddy. She was from Colombia and was a Soviet expert, and she started this program, and then it branched out to include then another one with China. Again, as I said, China at this point was isolationist. It wasn't. Oh no, it had just become the Beijing government had just become the Chinese representative And then they started a third one with Japan, which was a little easier because U.S. and Japan were not hostile. But still, Japan also had kind of a standoffish thing. They were still kind of keeping their head down because of the war, obviously. So it was UNA engaging with Japanese think tanks to again look for common interests. So that was in essence what two-track diplomacy is.
Mm-hmm. One function that the UNA chapters try to perform is to hold community programs on international issues, be it on human rights, economic and social development, be it on war and peace, whatever the situation may be. But they also, back really from the early 80s, I guess, all the way up to about 2000, did a multilateral studies project. What was the thrust of that to help inform Americans about these really complex issues?
Every year, the UNA board decided on a particular theme: environment, workers' rights, nuclear weapons. And what they would do is that their team, the UNA team, would write a briefing book on the themes and offering different ideas, different suggestions. The books were sent to the chapters would read them over. They would send back their suggestions of what could be incorporated in the final book, so that the final book came out incorporating as best they could all of the different views that were coming from the chapters, from the members around the country, as well as the experts in New York and Washington. And these papers were presented in the first case, to the U.S. mission, in the second case to the United Nations itself, and it also was used around the country because there was a public input. This wasn't just something coming out of a think tank. Grassroots had already had an input into what was in that paper.
Exactly. And again, as we mentioned earlier, the issues we're talking about today, if you want to learn more about the United Nations Association of the USA, go to www.unausa.org. And if you're interested, if you're overseas and interested in whether or not there's a UNA operation in your country, you can go to wfuna, wfuna.org. And again, there are about 100, possibly 102 members around the world that participate in the World Federation of the United Nations Association. Jim, we're down to about our last 2 minutes, the hardest part. You have been a longtime observer of the UN. You've written about the UN. You've covered their issues. What recommendations could you offer, one or two, very quickly, of how the UN can become more effective, more efficient? When I get an expert on the set, I just have to ask them that question.
They have to, the countries have to give the UN the authority to be effective, and the UN has to effectively use that mandate. I mean, that's kind of a bumper sticker, but there's 2 minutes left. I think that's in large part because when the UN can function, and I'm not talking about peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is a whole different problem because of the violence involved and the horrible things that UN peacekeepers have been involved in. But you take the agencies, again, even the small ones, relatively small ones. No, not going to do the acronyms. Meteorological, telecommunications, health, children, refugees, they're all doing amazing work. It's just, and as the world becomes more and more fractured, that they should, the nation should be giving more resources to the UN agencies that do such good work.
And they are on the ground. Even the Security Council cannot agree, perhaps wouldn't agree on a resolution pertaining to Syria. The UN agencies, the UN Children's Fund, the World Health Organization, all the UN agencies, the High Commission for Refugees, were on the ground in Syria helping to keep people alive. And of course, it's absolutely essential that we learn more about the United Nations and not necessarily be a cheering team, but be a constructive critic of the UN, because the UN does some really wonderful programs, and there's some areas where the UN needs to strengthen and to improve itself. And that's what the purpose of your book, to a large degree, I'm sure, the UN Association, A Little Known History of Advocacy and Action, that you just wrote not too long ago, will help us to better understand these issues. And again, it's just absolutely critical that we learn about them, because as the old saying goes, if the UN didn't exist today, we'd have to recreate it tomorrow. And so the best part is to just work with it and to perhaps tinker around a little bit and make it more efficient and to make it more effective. But Jim Wurst, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.